2004, 16-year-old Misty Tasker was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterwards, they hopped in her mother's truck and they got on the country highway and began making their way home. Their house was just 20 minutes down this highway. It was a straight shot. And this highway was pretty desolate. There were no street lights. It was actually a dirt road despite being a highway. And it was just thick forest on both sides of the road the entire way. There were no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would keep both hands on the wheel. She would sit up and kind of hunch over the wheel and keep her eyes intently focused on the road, but at night her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight. And so she would go to great lengths to not drive at night to avoid that high level of anxiety. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now Misty's mother is driving with the sun starting to set, and she's going as fast as she can to try to get home before it gets too dark. And so as they're bombing down this road at about 55 miles an hour, despite it being about a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty, who's in the passenger seat, just happens to look over at her mother for no particular reason. And as she's looking at her, she notices out her mother's window, it looks like there's a little girl sitting on the side of the road. What's a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She says to her mom, I think I just saw a little girl. And Misty's mother, who's high up on the wheel, she did not hear Misty the first time. She's just focused on driving and trying to get home. And so Misty says again, I think I just saw a little girl. We need to go back. I don't know what she's doing, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she's okay. And so Misty's mom looks over at her and she's not prepared to turn the car around. That means staying out later, and it means she's going to be driving in even darker conditions. And so she's like, did you really see someone? Because we got to get home. And Misty's like, Mom, I'm pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back. And so finally, Misty's mother, she's very annoyed, but she stops the car, she does a 3-point turn, and she begins driving back up the road where they came from towards this girl. Now, they had only made it about a half mile from where Misty believed she had seen this girl. And so pretty quickly, they slowed down because Misty said, I think she's in this area, and they both began scanning the right side of the road because that's where she's going to be now that they've turned around. Now, it was starting to get very dark outside, but there was enough light, and they had headlights. They were pretty confident they'd be able to spot this girl. And so as they're slow rolling down the road, they both see this girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest, and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother made a comment that it was a little bit surprising that this girl was out here. I mean, there's really nothing around here. There's no houses, there's no buildings, there's no trails to be walking in this forest on either side. It was just kind of thick forest. And so she just thought it was very strange that this girl would even be out here, especially because there's not any traffic on this road. And so Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her, and she told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just drive past her and get a look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. And so as they got right up next to her, they realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager, but she was not a young child. And as they drove right past her, they would expect her to turn around and acknowledge the car creeping up on her, considering there's no other traffic in the area and you're just some person sitting on the side of the road. You should definitely turn around and see what's behind you. But the girl did not acknowledge them. She just continued to have her knees up to her chest and rocked back and forth. And so Misty and her mother are a little bit freaked out by this, but they drive past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother does a 3-point turn, and when they're looking back down the road where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they're oriented back towards their house now, she wasn't there anymore. But there were no streetlights. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and so all they had was the headlights. And so Misty told her mom, drive up a little ways. Maybe the girl stood up and moved and we just can't see her because she's not in the headlights. And so Misty's mom began driving down the road and kind of turning slightly towards the left to shine the light more to the left, but there was no sign of this girl. For good measure, they turned right slightly to shine the lights more to the right-hand side of the road, but there was no sign of this girl. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the road, kind of keeping their eye out on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes, going about 5-10 miles an hour and seeing no sign of this girl, they decided that, well, she must have just gone back into the woods and gone back to wherever it was she came from. And so Misty's mom began picking up speed, and before long they had gone maybe 2 or 3 miles away from where they'd seen this girl, and they were coming up to this 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. And as they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped because on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was this girl sitting on the side of the road. She's got her back to the road, her knees are up, and she's rocking back and forth. And so Misty's mother pulls up the stop sign and then just sits there. And both women are just stunned at what they're looking at. They had just seen her 2-3 miles back down the road. It wasn't possible for her to get all the way up here. And so Misty's mother looks at her daughter and says, do you think it's a different girl? And Misty's like, no, that's the same girl. And so they just sat there for a minute until Misty started to panic. And she said to her mom, Mom, don't stop. I got a bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what's going on, but you can't stop next to this girl. But Misty's mom, she was definitely weirded out by this situation, no doubt. But she didn't feel good about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the side of the highway. And so even though she felt a little bit hesitant herself, she told Misty, we have to at least drive past her and ask if she's okay. That's the least we can do. And Misty was not having it. She said, Mom, do not stop. I got a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near this girl. But Misty's mom let up off the brake and began slow rolling past this intersection. And now at this point, Misty is just absolutely terrified. And so she takes her seatbelt off and she goes down into the footwell right in front of her seat. And she closes her eyes and covers her ears, and she just continues to beg her mother to just please keep going. Don't stop. But her mother just continues on until she stops right next to this girl who's still just sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road. She's got her knees up. She's rocking back and forth. She's not acknowledging Misty or her mother. And so Misty's mother turns to her daughter and says, please roll down your window. And Misty refuses. She's still down in the footwell, still in the fetal position. She's crying and she's still begging her mother to please just go home. And so Misty's mother, frustrated, reaches across the passenger seat and grabs the knob to roll down the window manually. So she rolls the window down, and Misty, who's down in the footwell, all she remembers is sitting there covering up her ears, and she's crying, and she opens her eyes and she's looking up towards her mom, who's reaching over the seat, and her mom yells out to this girl. And Misty remembers looking at her mom, who suddenly recoils in horror and screams, and then they take off like crazy, flying down the road. Misty jumps out of the footwell, and she's looking at her mom, and she's like, what's happening? What just happened? What did you see? And her mom's got her hand over her mouth, and she's speeding down the road, and she's crying now, and she's looking at Misty, and she just doesn't have the words to describe what she just saw. And so Misty's asking her mom, what did you see? What happened? And finally, her mother just said, she didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me. And so Misty screams and she's crying and her mom is crying, and they speed home. They're home just a couple of minutes later, and they run inside, practically falling over each other to get in the house. And as soon as they get inside, Misty's mom calls 911, and she didn't even know how to describe what she just saw. But she knew it was too embarrassing to try to describe it as some girl without a face sitting by the highway. And so she just told the police that they had seen a girl they think needs help. And so the police, they went out and they searched that entire stretch of highway. They looked for any sign of anybody out there, but there wasn't. There was never.
Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29th, 1972, passengers inside of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, which included the 13 crew members, had made it on board, and then at that point, the 13 crew members began making their final preparations for takeoff. Flight 401 was a very expensive and recently introduced model of plane by Eastern Airlines called the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, and it was both unbelievably technologically advanced and unbelievably enormous. It sat up to 400 passengers, which meant instead of having 4 seats to a row like you would expect inside of a passenger jet, the L-1011s had 8 seats per row, and they had 2 levels. There was the main level, which was the main cabin where all the passengers were, and then there was a second level, a lower level, that was only accessible via 2 small elevators that could barely fit 1 person inside of them in the back of the aircraft. And down on this lower level was a full-size kitchen, which had ovens and refrigerators, and also at the back of this lower level was a lounge area for flight staff. The pilot that night was Bob Loft, who was a strikingly handsome 55-year-old man with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, which for reference is a ton of flying experience. Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist who exuded confidence and who was cool under pressure. After Bob had boarded the aircraft, he had made his way right into the cockpit, which is the very front of the plane where the pilots fly the plane, and he had sat down in the customary captain's seat, which was the front left seat. And then after he had sat down, his 10 years younger first officer or co-pilot, a man named Bert Stockstill, had joined him in the cockpit and sat down in the customary co-pilot seat, which was directly to the right of Captain Bob. And so after the pilot and co-pilot were both seated, the remaining two members of that night's cockpit crew came into the cockpit. Now, normally in most passenger jets, there were only 2 seats in the cockpit, but because L-1011 planes were so massive, there were 4 seats in the cockpit. And so one of the last 2 men who joined the cockpit was 51-year-old Don Repo, who was the flight's engineer. And despite him being this big, strong ox of a man, he was actually known as being fairly soft-spoken and very approachable. And so Don came into the cockpit, he said hello, and then he sat down in the seat right behind the co-pilot, Bert. And then a few seconds after Don, the last man came into the cockpit. It was 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo. Angelo was not actually part of that night's flight crew. However, he was an employee of Eastern Airlines, and that night he needed to get to Miami, and so the company had put him on Flight 401 and sat him in the 4th and final seat in the cockpit right behind Captain Bob. Around 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks had been completed, all passengers were seated, as was the crew, and so Captain Bob began taxiing over to the runway. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward and the plane began to take off. A few minutes later, and Flight 401 was airborne up in the night sky over New York, headed south towards Miami. For the next 2 hours, this flight was completely normal. In fact, it was so normal that one of the passengers, named Jerry Escow, actually wrote a letter while he was on the plane telling Eastern Airlines how great their airline was and how smooth this flight was. His plan was, once they landed, to mail this letter to Eastern Airlines. But at 11:32 p.m., so 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this flight would go from being very routine and normal to being anything but. At 11:32 p.m., Captain Bob began his approach to Miami International Airport, but when he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed they had a problem. L-1011 jets, like 401, have 3 pieces of landing gear. They have wheels that come down under the left wing, they have wheels that come down under the right wing, and they have wheels that pop out of the nose of the plane. And each of these pieces of landing gear has a corresponding little light bulb, a green light bulb, inside the cockpit that once that piece of landing gear comes down and locks in place and is ready to be landed on, its green light will go on inside of the cockpit. But when Captain Bob lowered their landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed only 2 of the lights came on. The one that did not light up was the nose landing gear. Now, Captain Bob and the other men in the cockpit, when they saw this issue, they immediately assumed it had to be the light bulb itself that was faulty, not the actual nose landing gear, because this plane was brand new, it had been checked before they left, so the likelihood of the nose landing gear being faulty was incredibly slim. And so Captain Bob, while maintaining his approach towards Miami International, he retracted the landing gear, and then once it had come back into the plane, he just lowered it again, thinking this time all 3 lights would come on. But once again, once the landing gear was deployed the second time, still the nose landing gear light did not come on. And so frustrated, Captain Bob hopped on the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control and told them that he could not confirm his landing gear was actually safe to land on, and so they would have to circle around for a bit in the sky and get it figured out. And so Miami Air Traffic Control acknowledged what Captain Bob said and then directed Captain Bob to fly out over the nearby Everglades, which is a massive wetlands area in Florida, and to stay out over the Everglades away from other traffic until they fixed the problem. And so once Flight 401 was out over the Everglades flying in a circular pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot so that it would maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a constant speed of 200 miles per hour. And so once the plane was all set, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert began fiddling with this front nose gear indicator light bulb, which they were convinced was faulty. And so they started by pressing on the light, and when that didn't work, they began twisting it. And when that didn't work, they actually pulled the light bulb off the panel and kind of blew the dirt and grime off of it. And then they jammed it back into the panel. But as soon as they did, not only did it not go back on, but they realized they had put it in sideways. And so they couldn't actually get it out again. And so now they're thinking, this light's not going to go on at all. We need to find another way to make sure the nose landing gear has come down. And so Captain Bob at this point is totally frustrated. And so he turns around and he looks at Don Repo, the flight engineer who's sitting right behind the co-pilot, and he tells Don to go down into the hellhole and directly inspect the front landing gear himself. So the hellhole is a space right below the cockpit, and the way you get to it is through a trap door in the floor in the center of the cockpit. And then once down in the hellhole, there is this window that looks straight towards the front of the aircraft where you could look out and actually see the front landing gear, and you could make sure it was down or not. And so Don Repo, he gets out of his seat and he opens up the hellhole trap door and he makes his way down below. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below Flight 401, a 43-year-old man named Robert Marquise, along with a friend of his, were looking for frogs in the Everglades, riding around on Robert's airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottom boat with this huge fan on the back of it that propels it forward. It's popular in the Everglades because the water depth is so shallow. At points in the Everglades, the water's only a couple of inches deep. And so all around these two guys, it is totally pitch black out. There are no buildings or people for miles and miles and miles. Their only light source is Robert's headlamp. And so at some point, Robert turns off the airboat and he and his friend are just standing in the middle of it, kind of scanning around on either side. And all around them, they can hear the sound of alligators growling and snakes and frogs moving about the tall grass. And as they're just kind of silently looking around them, out of the corner of Robert's eye, he sees something. And so he looks up right as he sees this huge orange and yellow flash that kind of came out of the ground roughly 5 miles away from where they were. And basically, as soon as Robert saw it, this flash dissipated and it was just totally gone. And so he turned to his friend who had not seen this flash. And Robert said, "Hey, let's go investigate. Let's see what that was." And so Robert fired up his boat again and he began flying across the Everglades straight in the direction of where he saw this flash. And after 15 minutes of cruising at 40 miles per hour across this dark expanse, they reached the area where this flash had been. And Robert and his friend, they just could not believe what they were looking at. About 20 minutes earlier, back up inside of Flight 401, when Captain Bob turned around in his seat to tell the flight engineer, Don Repo, to go down into the hellhole, it's believed that Captain Bob nudged the steering wheel with his leg. And this little nudge was enough to disengage the plane's autopilot, which sent the plane into a gradual descent. But nobody noticed. Because, one, it was totally pitch black outside, the Everglades below them, there's no lights, there's nothing, and there was no moon that night. And so when they're looking out the window, there would have been no visual cues that they were going down, up, or anything. It just would have looked like a total void outside. And two, the descent they were now suddenly in was so gradual, it would not have felt like they were tumbling out of the sky. It would have felt like they were just cruising as expected. And three, all of the men in the cockpit were completely fixated on this light bulb problem. In fact, they were so fixated that when an alarm went off inside of the cockpit telling them they had dipped below their intended altitude of 2,000 feet, they were now going down, nobody noticed. Although, to their credit, this alarm only sounded once and it wasn't that loud. And so not long after Don Repo had gone down into the hellhole, The plane crashed into the Everglades. No one on board Flight 401, from the cockpit crew to the passengers to the other flight staff, had any idea they were in an emergency until they hit the ground. And when they hit the ground, the plane exploded, and that was what Robert Marquis saw when he looked up and saw that yellow and orange flash. And so Robert and his friend, they speed over to the crash site, and when they get there, they are the first ones there. And even though they're looking out and they can hear the sound of all these people screaming and crying and moaning, they can't see anything because the fire from this huge explosion was already out, because the swampy wetlands had pretty much immediately extinguished it. And even though the plane had crashed into the ground at over 200 miles per hour, it had not struck the ground at a very steep angle, because basically the plane was in this gradual descent pattern and just kind of coasted until it hit the ground. And so that, combined with the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades, meant that the impact of the plane hitting the ground was not nearly as violent as other plane crashes were. And that ultimately saved lives. In fact, dozens of passengers survived the initial impact with the ground. But many of them were left with these horrible injuries, or they were trapped within the wreckage, or both. When Robert and his friend arrived at the edge of the crash scene, Robert lifted up his headlamp and began to scan, and he saw all these body parts sticking out of the ground, and then his light rested on the first survivor he saw, and it was this man whose clothes had been completely burned off from the explosion. All he had on was just a little bit of his socks on both ankles, and this man was still strapped into the seat that he had been on the plane, and when the plane had broken up, his seat had fallen forward into the mud, pinning this man's upper body and most of his face under several inches of water. And so as Robert had scanned over with his light had hit this man's face, and he had looked up and pleaded with Robert and his friend to come get him before he drowned. And so Robert and his friend, they jumped off their boat and ran over to this guy and pulled the chair up and out of the water, saving this guy's life. But as soon as he was up and out of the water, Robert and his friend began hearing more calls from other people in the darkness screaming for help. Robert and his friend would do their absolute best to save as many people as they possibly could, but there was just too many people who needed saving and not enough time. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the scene, the Coast Guard showed up in helicopters, and they, along with Robert and his friend, would spend the entire night pulling as many people to safety as they possibly could. By the time the sun came up on the following day, there were no other survivors left to save. All told, 99 people perished and 77 survived. Amongst the dead were Captain Bob Loft and his co-pilot Bert Stockstill and their flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole. Amongst these survivors was Angelo Donadeo, the fourth man in the cockpit, as well as Jerry Ascow, the man who ironically had written that letter to Eastern Airlines saying how wonderful that flight had been. A major investigation following the crash would confirm that the reason Flight 401 went down was because of a number of factors, most notably human error. The investigation would also confirm that the nose landing gear was working perfectly fine. The light bulb not coming on was a result of the light bulb being burned out. Following the investigation, Eastern Airlines would make every effort to compensate both the survivors of the crash and also families of those who were killed in the crash. Eastern Airlines would also make major changes to their training for their pilots and co-pilots and anybody that was ever going to be in the cockpit to ensure this type of disaster never happened again. But this was not the end of the story for Flight 401. In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these two women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these two women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011, just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now, for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate thing to do. These parts were extremely expensive and they worked perfectly fine and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318, and after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight. And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. And so at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began heading down to the second level, Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level to see if Denise needed any help. And so the two women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was. And they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So when you come down on either of those two elevators, when the doors open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very, very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other. And then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards. If you were to walk down the kitchen straight towards the front of the plane, you would eventually reach a wall that separated the kitchen to the lounge area, and there was a door slightly off to the right side on this wall that you could walk through to get into the lounge. So if you were standing in the kitchen and looking in the direction of this door, you wouldn't really be able to see into the lounge area because, again, the door was kind of off to the side. You would have to actually go over to the door and poke your head through to get a full unobstructed view of the lounge. And all the lounge was a couple of sofas and chairs kind of arranged in a circle. So Ginny has gotten back in the elevator and she's made her way back downstairs to continue looking for Denise. She gets down to the lower level, the doors open up, and she looks out into the kitchen, and Denise is not there. In fact, the kitchen is totally empty. And the door leading into the lounge area is shut, so she can't even see in part of the way into the lounge to see if anybody is in there. But the second Ginny stepped off the elevator into the kitchen, she immediately had this powerful sense that Denise was definitely down there somewhere on the second level with her, probably in the lounge area that she couldn't see. And because Ginny felt so confident that Denise was down there, she actually didn't start by calling out for Denise or walking to the door, opening it up, and looking into the lounge to make sure Denise was there. Instead, Ginny just turned to the left and went to the ovens and began preparing food for the attendants upstairs. And as she's making these plates of food, Ginny would periodically look over at the closed door leading into the lounge, kind of expecting it to open up at any point and see Denise walk out. But after a couple of minutes, no one had opened the door from the lounge, and Ginny was thinking to herself, I'm making quite a bit of noise over here. If anybody was down here, wouldn't they come out of the lounge and just see who it was? And because Ginny, again, had this really intense feeling that she was not alone down there, she began to think, wait a minute, is Denise playing a practical joke on me? Is she hiding in the lounge? Or is she hiding in one of the cabinets on the right side here, and she's going to jump out and grab me? And so the second Ginny began thinking about that, she became really paranoid. And so as she's making this food, she's pretty much constantly looking over at the door or kind of scanning behind her, waiting for Denise to launch out and scare her. But again, after several more minutes, Ginny didn't see anybody come out of the lounge and none of the cabinet doors opened up. It was just her down there. However, the longer she stayed down there, the stronger that feeling got that someone was in the room with her. And so now she can't even make her food. She's completely turned around, just scanning all around the kitchen, really at this point, hoping Denise jumps out to scare her. And when Denise didn't do that, Ginny just began walking over to the door that would lead into the lounge. And so when she reached the door, her heart was racing like mad. She reached down to the handle, she turned it, she pushed it open, and she poked her head in real quick. And there was no one in the lounge. But immediately, the second her head was in that room, that feeling that someone was down there with her spiked, and she got chills all over her body. And she ran into the back of the lounge and looked behind all of the chairs and sofas, praying at this point that Denise was going to be down there. But after looking all over the back of the lounge, there was no one there. And so finally, Ginny turns around and she's totally racked with fear because now she's on the very far end of the lounge. There's no one in the lounge. She knows there's no one in the kitchen. And here she is still getting that sensation that she was not alone down there. But she has to go all the way back across the lounge through that door into the kitchen to get back to the elevators so she can escape. And so Ginny almost instinctively moved immediately to the left side of the lounge and put her back up against the wall to make sure no one could be behind her. And then she began slowly inching her way along the left wall towards the door that was now open that would lead back into the kitchen. And as she's slowly shimmying along, her view of the kitchen is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the whole time she's thinking, I'm going to see someone in the kitchen because this sensation that someone is down here with me is not going away. But when she finally gets to the door and crosses into the kitchen, there's still no one there. And so she makes a run at that point to the elevator. She starts hitting the button. And as she's hitting the button, she's turning around and she has that awful feeling that someone's right behind her. And then finally the car comes down. She hops inside the elevator. She shuts the doors. She hits the button and she begins going back up. When the elevator cart got back to the main level and the doors opened again, Ginny almost knocked over the flight attendant that was standing right outside of it, a woman named Mildred. And after Mildred and Ginny kind of regained their balance, they both looked at each other, and Mildred could see very clearly that Ginny looked horrible. She was totally pale, she was sweating, and so Mildred said, Ginny, are you okay? What's going on? And Ginny would just say, I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on. I don't know. But Mildred, instead of asking follow-up questions, just said, Ginny, you need to come with me. And so Ginny would follow Mildred, who led them back around behind the elevators to the space in the back of the plane, kind of out of view of the passengers. And there, Ginny would find Denise. And Denise looked pale as a ghost. She was sweating and looked totally shaken up. It would turn out when Ginny left the lower level for the first time to come up to the main level to look for Denise, and then learned that Denise was not up there, that Denise had actually gone down to look for Ginny. In those few minutes that Ginny was up on the main level before she went back down again to continue looking for Denise, Denise was on the lower level. And Denise would say when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, there was no one down there, but immediately she believed Ginny had to be down there because of this strong sense that she was not alone down there. However, when she opened up the door to look into the lounge, she didn't see anyone and it totally spooked her. She shut the door, she ran back to the elevators, and she went back upstairs. And as she was going up in her elevator car, who, once again, passed her in the other elevator car? Ginny. And so once again, the two women did not see each other. And so these two women, who had never experienced anything like this before in their lives, had nearly identical experiences, totally independent of each other, just a couple of minutes apart in the exact same space. It was just too many coincidences for them to totally write it off. And so that was a big reason why they felt like they had to come forward with their information. One month later, plane number 318, the same plane that Ginny and Denise had had their frightening experiences on, was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, undergoing pre-flight checks from its crew before its flight to Miami that morning. After most of the checks were done, the passengers were allowed to board the plane, and then after it seemed like most of the passengers had arrived and taken their seats, the senior flight attendant, whose name was Sis, began counting the people on board the plane to make sure they had everyone. And after counting up and down the rows, she realized their head count was off by 1. They had one too many people. And so when Sis began recounting, she actually quickly identified the discrepancy. Sis was standing in first class in the aisle, and as she was counting down the left side of first class passengers, she noticed there was an Eastern Airlines captain seated in one of the seats. And so immediately Sis thought, oh, okay, I don't recognize this person, but since he's in uniform, he must be deadheading. Deadheading is a fairly common practice for airline employees where if they need to be on a particular flight but are not physically at the origin airport, they will just hop on another company flight that happens to be going to the airport they need to go to. And at least in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for employees not necessarily to tell the flight staff until they were literally on the plane, because these employees would just check the manifest, see if there were openings, and then climb on board. And so Sis assumed that was exactly what this man had done, and that was why he was unaccounted for, and it was why they had this extra person. And so she just needed to get his name to account for him. And so Sis turned and took a couple of steps until she was right in front of this guy who was still just seated looking straight ahead, and Sis introduced herself and asked him if he was deadheading. But the captain just continued to stare straight ahead and didn't even seem to register that Sis was talking to him, despite the fact that Sis was right on top of him and speaking very, very clearly, and nobody else was talking. And so Sis, who was aware of the fact that this guy clearly should have heard her, just kind of waited for a second and then just asked again, hey, what's your name? I need to make sure that you are in fact deadheading. But again, this captain just sat there without moving and didn't remotely react to Sis. Now, by this point, another flight attendant named Diane had looked over and actually saw Sis having this strange interaction with this Eastern Airlines captain. And so Diane walked over and listened as Sis, for a third time, tried to get this guy's attention, but he still did nothing. And so Diane and Sis, they start looking at each other like, what do we do about this? And at some point, Sis just says, okay, I'm going to go tell the captain, he can deal with this. And so Diane stayed in the aisle next to this silent seated captain while Sis turned and walked towards the cockpit, and she told the captain, whose name was George. And so George, he leaves the cockpit with Sis by his side, and they start walking down the aisle back towards where this guy was and where Diane was. And by the time they get there, 6 other passengers kind of in the general vicinity had noticed something strange was going on. And so they were all kind of turned around in their seats, looking at this captain who was sitting there, and Diane and Sis and George kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. And so George and Sis, they walk right up alongside Diane and this seated silent captain, and George immediately crouched down to get a good look at this guy's face, because again, this captain is just looking straight ahead with a hat on, and so no one had really looked at him yet. And so George kneels down and he sees this guy's face for the first time, and he falls over and goes, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft!" The same Bob Loft who had died on Flight 401, the captain of Flight 401. George had known Bob really well and knew exactly what Bob looked like. But before Bob, Sis, Diane, or the 6 other passengers that were all watching could do anything, the seated, silent captain that looked exactly like Bob Loft vanished into thin air right in front of all of them. And immediately, these 6 passengers on board the flight that saw this happen became hysterical. They could not understand what they had just seen. People are screaming and crying. And George, Diane, and Sis, they were very shaken at what they saw, but they knew they were in charge of this flight. And so they tried to calm down the passengers, but then very quickly, they organized a search of the plane because they're telling themselves, no one can just disappear into thin air. This guy has to be somewhere on the plane. And so for over an hour, the passengers were told to stay in their seats and were told to stay calm while the flight crew searched every crevice, every nook and cranny of this flight to see if they could find this guy. But they never did. And so after a very long delay, plane number 318, along with its very shaken up passengers and flight crew, eventually rumbled out onto the runway and took off. When they landed in Miami, the first thing George, Diane, and Sis all did is they went in and filed a report about what they had seen, about this vanishing person. But Eastern Airline didn't do anything about their reports. In fact, the logbook where these reports were kept was conspicuously missing a couple of weeks later when some other employees of the airline heard about this vanishing person and wanted to read the reports themselves. And when these employees went to their superiors and asked if they could get this logbook, the answer from the top was, George, Diane, and Sis never filed those reports. There was no vanishing person. This whole thing is a bunch of crap. But George, Diane, and Sis all said, we filed those reports, and apparently some other pilots within Eastern Airlines had actually seen the reports before the logbook went missing, and they would tell other people that what they read was terrifying. Over the next 2 years, there would be an astounding number of other totally unexplainable events that took place on other planes within Eastern Airlines' fleet. However, the strange events only occurred on L-1011 jets that had parts on them from the crashed Flight 401. Some of these unexplained events included more sightings of the silent, seated captain who looked just like Bob Loft. And in fact, one of those sightings was by an Eastern Airlines executive who, after seeing this captain vanish into thin air right in front of him, the executive freaked out and ran off the plane and demanded the plane be searched top to bottom. But like the last search, nothing was found. On another occasion, the catering company that loaded food directly into the second level of these L-1011s, basically right into the kitchen, one of their staff spotted a man wandering around the lower level that looked just like Don Repo, the flight engineer from the doomed Flight 401. And when this staff member spoke to this man who looked like Don Repo turned towards him and then vanished into thin air. The catering company was so scared when this happened that they refused to go back into the plane, and it caused a massive delay. On another flight, on board plane number 318, the pilot and co-pilot began hearing banging coming from the hellhole, and when the pilot got up and opened up the hellhole and went down below and shined his light, he didn't see anything, but when he went to climb back up into the cockpit, he looked up, and standing in the cockpit was once again Don Repo looking straight down at him, who then promptly vanished right in front of him. On another flight, a female passenger and coach, who had been quiet the entire flight, suddenly began screaming hysterically. And when they went up to her and asked her what was wrong, she was pointing at the seat next to her and said a man had suddenly appeared right next to her. He did not walk in, he just appeared next to her, and then when she began screaming, he vanished right in front of her. This woman was so upset that when they landed finally in Phoenix, Arizona, she had to be restrained in a straitjacket when they pulled her off the plane. But as terrifying as all of these events were, there was at least one instance where these apparitions appeared to be helpful to the people on the plane. One captain said he walked into the cockpit, and standing in there was flight engineer Don Repo, and Don promptly told the captain about a specific malfunction in one of the engines before Don vanished in front of this captain. Now, this captain was horrified at what he had just seen, but he did actually go down and have that engine looked at, and sure enough, the malfunction that Don Repo said it had. Then finally, in 1974, all of these strange events just came to an abrupt stop. Now, no one knows exactly why, but in 1974, Eastern Airlines, despite telling the world they didn't believe any of the reports of these strange happenings on their planes, despite that year, they went into every single one of their L-1011 jets, and they removed any parts that had been placed on them from the crashed Flight 401. Despite the fact none of those parts were faulty. They were removing perfectly good parts, and they never gave a reason. And after they did that, all the sightings just stopped. Around midnight on September 3rd, 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife. They talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, what are you doing here? And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway, and he saw that Kristen wasn't home, and it looked like nobody was home, and so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the two of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long the two of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down, Wayne throws her some cord, she ties up her husband's arms and legs, and then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole, and then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in, and then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again. And then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table. And then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other 2 miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne,
him and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol, and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman. And so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail, deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically, he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes go wide and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this. And so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. You know, maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire. There's no flashlight. There is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal. So he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time he can't really just write it off. Clearly there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone. And clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost. And they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon, and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way, and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question, a bit more forcefully this time.
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
His voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's going to fall, get hurt, he's going to get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 a.m, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again. He didn't see him again. And he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. And the sun came up. Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day, as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent, and he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then, as he's laying there, from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds. And he would stop periodically and moan and grunt. And he'd kick up leaves. And then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel. He finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime. He was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear, and all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
On April 27th, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field, and they start digging. And pretty quickly, their shovels strike something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she'd been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out, and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewey. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewey's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewey last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewey relented, and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her, and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewey's belongings inside, Siraji said, okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make. And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewey, He'd also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women. And if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them. And he would hand the woman a shovel and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground. And he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep. And then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized. And then at this point, Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewi, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewi that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewi was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house, they went through the cemetery, out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life.
In 2010, Kayla was a senior at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a big party school. And one Friday evening, Kayla and her friends were at a big party, and Kayla was having a great time, but she was starting to feel really tired. And so she asked her friends if maybe they wanted to leave early, but none of them did. And so Kayla left on her own. Luckily, her house was just down the road, and so she was at her front door in a matter of minutes. That night, her 2 roommates, who were also college seniors, had decided to stay in and just have a nice night with a couple of friends having some wine. And so when Kayla walked inside, she happened to turn to the right and she looked on the closest wall where there was a sofa, and she saw there was a guy laying there with a blanket up to his chin and his eyes were wide open. She didn't recognize him, but he was staring at her, and she figured, oh, he must be a friend of her roommates. But as she walked across the room, she kind of glanced back at him, and he had pulled the covers down slightly and he had lifted his head up and he was staring at her kind of menacingly. And so Kayla got a really bad vibe from this guy and just kind of hustled into her room, shut the door behind her, and locked it, something she never did. And a few minutes later, she was in her bed and she was passed out. A couple of hours later, she woke up to what sounded like tapping on wood. And so she sat up in her bed and she's kind of looking around. She had a couple drinks the night before and she's half asleep, so she's a bit disoriented. But finally, when she gets her bearings, she realizes this tapping sound is the sound of someone drumming their fingers on the outside of her door. And so she's looking at her door, wondering who would be doing that. And then all of a sudden, the drumming stops, and it's replaced by the sound of this person scratching on the outside of the door. And so now Kayla's thinking, okay, is this guy who was out on that couch, is he playing a joke on me? And so she's sitting there wondering if she should just go over there and open the door and tell him to stop. But before she gets out of her bed, the scratching gets louder and louder and louder until it's so loud that it's kind of menacing. And so Kayla decides she's not going to go out there. And so instead, she pulls out her phone and she texts her roommate and says, hey, can you please come out in the living room and take care of your friend who's harassing me? But she doesn't get a response from that roommate, and the scratching is just still loud as ever. And so she texts her other roommate the same message, come out and take care of your buddy here. But again, she doesn't get a response. And now the scratching on the door has stopped, and it's been replaced by jiggling of her doorknob. And so now Kayla is just mad because this is obviously a prank, and it's a dumb prank. And so she yells out, hey, stop! But it doesn't do anything. And so now Kayla's like, okay, I gotta call my roommates, wake them up, they'll come out and they'll handle it. And so she calls one of her roommates, and they do pick up this time. And Kayla angrily tells them, hey, come out into the living room and tell your friend to knock it off. He's totally harassing me. And her roommate was confused. She's trying to make sense of what Kayla's saying. And she says, Kayla, what are you talking about? What friend are you talking about? And Kayla says, the guy sleeping on the couch, the guy in our living room sleeping on the couch. And her roommate said, Kayla, we didn't have anybody over last night. Somebody out there? You need to call the police. Kayla's adrenaline surged, and she very calmly told her roommate, lock your door immediately. And right then she noticed the jiggling of her doorknob and the scratching, and it all stopped. And Kayla's wondering, where did this guy go? And then after a couple of seconds, she heard extremely loud banging coming from across the house where her two roommates shared a room. And it was the sound of this guy trying to smash down their door. And so Kayla's screaming, her roommates are screaming. Kayla manages to dial up 911, and before long there are sirens outside, and Kayla hears the sound of this guy run across the house, and she hears the sliding door open and shut. The police come inside, they search the property, and there's no sign of this guy, and so Kayla and the roommates come outside. They talk to the police, and the police bring them over to their side door, and they show them on the outside there was all sorts of scratch marks all over the doorknob and right around the latch. And they said it looks like he was able to jimmy his way into your house through this door. And so then they asked the girls to give their statement about what happened, and they started with Kayla. They went over to her bedroom door so she could demonstrate what happened, and that's when they noticed there were all these scratch marks and gouge marks all over the outside of her bedroom door, and all over the doorknob, and all over the latch. And on the ground was a pair of scissors and a knife. And the police told Kayla that it looks like he used those scissors and that knife to open up the side door, and he was trying to use those tools again to open up her door, but for whatever reason, he just couldn't do it. They told Kayla that most likely when she went in the front door, she caught this guy off guard. Maybe he was trying to rob the place, maybe he had just broken in, but either way, Kayla got in and ruined his plans. And so he leapt onto that sofa, the one against that inner wall, to kind of tuck himself away in hopes that maybe Kayla wouldn't look over and see him. And they told her that most likely when she made eye contact with him, she became a witness and therefore a target of opportunity. And had she not locked her door, who knows what would have happened. In 1956, the SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship.
But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the two ships, it was too late. A collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. And unbeknownst to his coworkers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria, and just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries, and he ran towards the front of the Stockholm, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the Stockholm was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash.
People have claimed over the years to have been abducted by aliens, and realistically there's no tangible evidence that any human being has ever actually set foot in an extraterrestrial spacecraft or another dimension or anything like that. It's just these crazy stories from people that claim this happened to them. And while many of these stories are very quickly cast aside as absolute hoax, not true, not accurate, there's one story, one abduction story that is universally regarded as the most believable and most famous alien abduction story, and that is of Travis Walton. What made this case so famous is that unlike all of the other alien abduction cases where there was never any proof, it was usually one person's first-hand account. In this case, you have a full-scale police investigation. You have up to 16 lie detector tests that were taken by Travis Walton himself, along with the other witnesses and people that were there. And you have a group of 6 level-headed guys that actually witnessed the abduction take place and have stuck to their story and have passed all lie detector tests and have never changed their story in 40 years. And you would think that at some point you might change your story because they came under incredible scrutiny. I mean, it basically derailed most of their careers and their lives because they were labeled as crazy people for believing that a UFO had abducted Travis Walton. I mean, in a way, they became famous, but in all the worst ways. So you have all these elements that make this story seem fairly credible. And even if this wasn't an alien abduction, let's say, how do you account for the past lie detector tests that are talking about UFOs? How do you account for the fact that Travis Walton was really missing for 5 days and has no idea where he was? And there was a full search effort to find him in the area where he would have been. So lots of unanswered questions, but the story itself of when he was actually abducted, and then his own story about what happened once he had been abducted, it makes for just an incredible story. It's been converted into books and movies, and to this day, it remains one of, if not the single most fascinating purported alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 of these stories every week. So if that's something that interests you, I would encourage you to gently extirpate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive into the story. By 1975, Travis Walton, who was 22 years old at the time, had developed a bad boy reputation in his hometown of Snowflake, Arizona. You know, he rode a noisy Harley-Davidson motorcycle through town. He was a wild bull rider, and he was a boxer. And there was a story about Travis when he was with his friends in a car and they were driving down this road and a bear jumped out of the woods and landed in the middle of the road and was just standing there. And Travis, without any hesitation, leaps out of his car and chases after this huge bear and scares it into the woods, and in fact chased it up into the woods. So Travis was just known as this kind of rebel, problem child a little bit, but he was beloved by his friends. He was just like one of those cool guys that he did it his own way. So Travis and the 6 other men that he worked with were loggers. They were given contracts and they would go out and they would clear trees in a certain area. They were not big time with huge equipment to do this. We're talking chainsaws, regular saws and axes. And they would just go out, these blue collar, like hard working type guys, and they would clear areas of trees. That's what they did. Now, these 7 men, they did a dangerous job. I mean, you're cutting down these huge trees and you're usually working pretty quickly. You're operating, chainsaws that are pretty dangerous. And Mike Rogers, who was the crew boss, who was there the day of this event, he described in a number of his interviews that, the men that he hired to do these jobs, they needed to be incredibly level-headed. It did not strike you as people that would have this fantastical, alien encounter story. On November 5th, 1975, Mike Rogers was given a contract to clear out this huge 1,200-acre plot of land inside of the Sitgreaves National Forest. And he grabbed his crew, they piled into the one pickup truck that Mike owned, and Mike knew that this was going to be a really, really difficult job. It was a huge area to cover. And he told his men up front, we're going to be working really, really hard, so expect long, full days. And so over the first 3 days of the job, even though they were working, long, long hours and barely taking any breaks, they were behind schedule. At the end of this 3rd day, it's late at night, they've worked all day, and everybody is just totally exhausted. And so finally they wrap up, and they all pile back into Mike's truck, all 7 of them, and they start driving the access road back down to the main road to get back to the town. And as they're driving, they're not really talking about work at all. They're kind of joking about what they're going to do that night. And as they're driving down the road, and again, it's heavily forested, they look off to the right, and there is some lights in the forest. They would say in interviews that they all noticed it, but it did not stand out as anything particularly bad. It just could be anything. They weren't thinking about it. But as they were driving down this road and this light, I guess, got brighter, or maybe they couldn't help but notice it, they all started commenting on this light, and they're looking at it, and somebody suggested that, it's probably just the moon, it's a full moon. But then one of the guys on the other side of the truck happened to look out his side, away from where that light was, and he goes, no, the moon's over here, it's on this side of the road. So they're like, okay, it's not the moon. And then someone suggested, maybe it's a forest fire. Like, maybe we should go check it out. That could be a forest fire. But then Mike Rogers, the driver, the crew boss, was like, no, there'd be smoke. There's no smoke or anything. And Travis, who, he's the guy that's jumping out of cars to go chase down bears, and he's like a total kind of adrenaline junkie type. He's like, hey, let's just drive over there and see what it is. Like, I don't know, it could be anything. Let's go check it out. The guys in the truck were a little on edge about it, but ultimately said, what's the harm? We'll drive over. We know there's a road that brings us over to that section of the forest. We'll get a look at whatever this is, and then we'll leave. So they drive down this other little access road, and they come to a clearing where these lights were, and they are astounded at what they see. They were all polygraphed separately about what they saw when they reached this clearing. Each of them described the same thing with slightly different details because it's from their own perspective. And the polygraph tests all showed that they were telling the truth. They saw this disc-shaped craft with what looked like panels of lights on the underside, hovering in a clearing, maybe 50 or 100 feet off the ground, not spinning or anything, just floating in midair, as if it was suspended. And the men, in their interviews later on TV shows and books, they would say what struck them was not just the fact that there's this craft here, but how bizarre it was to see this thing defying gravity. It's not moving, but it's hovering over the air and it's right in front of us. And one of the men even commented at length, because he would build houses and he was a handy guy. And he started talking about the structural framework of this craft. He could see that there was really impressive engineering on the underside of this craft. It was just this beautiful, beautiful machine. And they're looking at it, and Travis is so excited when they get to this clearing. He doesn't even know what he's looking at, but much like the bear, where he jumps out and chases the bear, as soon as they were almost at a stop in this clearing right next to the ship, he's jumping out of the car. Nobody else is, just Travis. And he starts walking just a little ways away from the car towards this craft. The craft doesn't move. The craft is maybe from where they parked, maybe 50 or 100 feet away from them, and then 50 or 100 feet in the air. And the crew doesn't say anything. They're just dumbfounded by what they're looking at. Travis is also dumbfounded, but he's walking towards the ship. And he would say in an interview that he was frightened, but he was mostly curious. He knew he was looking at something that no one knew what it was. Some sort of craft. They didn't know what it was, but it was fascinating to him. And he kept walking closer and closer and closer to it. And as the crew kind of came out of their initial shock of seeing this unidentified flying object in the sky, they start yelling for Travis to come back. They had this bad sense that something was going to happen, and they thought you shouldn't go near it, like, come back. Not to mention it's hovering in the air. What if it falls and it lands on you? Like, hey, Travis, come back over here. And then it was like once one person started yelling for Travis to come back, they all did. And so Travis remembered hearing them screaming for him to come back to the car, but he's not really paying any attention. He's still walking. And finally he stops. He's just looking at it. And Travis would say he was just struck at just the beauty of the underside of this craft with all these different panels of lights built into it. It was this incredible piece of machinery. And he's looking at it, and then all of a sudden it starts spinning. Just a little bit, and it starts emitting this noise that all of them reported hearing, this loud mechanical sound. And now the yells from the crew are getting louder and louder, and Travis would say that he knew he needed to turn around and go back, but he just wanted to look for a few more seconds, and he was about to turn and go back to the truck when all of a sudden a beam of light comes out and strikes Travis like a lightning strike. And all of the crew saw this happen. He gets blown 20 feet away. Like he gets lifted off the ground and thrown 20 feet. And they watched it happen. And again, in all of their polygraph tests, they all said the same thing. All passed. He was hit by a ray of light from this UFO, knocked him 20 feet back. Mike Rogers, in a panic, along with everybody else in the crew, they just decide to leave. And they're convincing themselves, as Mike is driving away like a maniac, leaving Travis behind, they're convincing themselves that he's dead already. We just watched him get shot by something. We don't know what that is. And they're freaked out. They don't even know what they saw. They're crying. They're hysterical. These are grown men, just absolutely terrified. And they're driving a little ways until finally Mike just hits the brakes and he stops. And Mike is like, we have to go back for him. He was like, if you guys want to stay here and wait for me, that's fine. But this truck is going back to get Travis. And so the idea of waiting out in the open after seeing what they just saw was even worse than going back. They wanted to stay together. So a little bit begrudgingly, although they knew they needed to, they all got back in the truck, turned around and started driving back up to the UFO site. As they make it back up, they notice that there is no lights up there. The craft is gone and there's no Travis. And they get out, and now Mike is uncontrollably crying because he feels like they just abandoned him, and where did he go? Everybody else is in shock. They can't believe it. They start screaming for Travis. They're running around the woods, yelling for Travis, looking for signs of Travis. They really don't know what happened, but they know Travis is not here.
And after a little bit of time of looking, they're like, we have to tell the police. And they knew that it was going to be bad for them when they told police. The story is a UFO came and zapped Travis and now he's gone. That doesn't really sit well with police. But they knew, because they wanted to find Travis and they were very concerned about their friend, they knew they had to tell police. Mike and a few of the other crew were just unable to even think. They were crying, they were upset. And so finally they get to a payphone, the first payphone they saw, because this is 1975. And Ken Peterson, who was this very kind of simple, matter-of-fact guy, recently married, just very simple guy, very level-headed guy. He decides to call the police because he's the only one who was, I guess, composed enough to do it. And so he calls the sheriff's department and he says, you got to come out here. We can't find our friend Travis Walton. We'll have to describe it to you when you get here, because trying to do it over the phone is not going to do it justice. But he's gone and we don't know where he went. So shortly thereafter, Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Ken Copeland, their partners, they show up at this rest stop where this payphone was, and they get to the scene. They see Ken Peterson, who made the call to them, and they're like, all right, tell us what's going on. The crew has now gotten out of the truck. They look distraught for sure. And Ken begins to try to describe what happened, but he hasn't said UFO. He hasn't said aliens. He's just said, we were up at the logging site. We had a contract up there. And then, just, it's hard to describe. And Mike Rogers jumps in. He's like, we saw a UFO and a ray of light hit Travis and then he disappeared. And the sheriffs are looking at them like, really? And so they stopped them and were like, all right, I need to search your truck to make sure you guys aren't under the influence of something. And they're like, we haven't done anything. We've been working all day. They search the truck, nothing. They check each of them to see if they're sober, and their field test showed they were all sober. And the Sheriff Gillespie, who was the overall in charge sheriff, even though he was a total skeptic, and so was Sheriff Copeland as well, he would say about that first engagement with the 6 crew members that they were obviously shaken up by something. Something had happened. They don't know what it was, but they were shaken up. And what Sheriff Gillespie believed was that they were creating a hoax to cover up a real crime. He believed that they had harmed Travis Walton and they were using a UFO to cover it up. But he also was thinking to himself, like, this is a bad hoax. It's not very well planned. They don't really have their stories really lined up particularly well. They're not doing a good job explaining it. The only thing they're doing well is acting scared. A couple hours later, the sun's starting to come up because it was super late when all this happened. And Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copeland have organized this huge search effort up in the forest where Travis had gone missing. And the crew members, they're all there as well. A bunch of volunteers showed up and they are scouring the area. I mean, they got dogs out. They got these huge teams looking everywhere and they can't come up with anything. I mean, they're looking everywhere. There's no sign. There's nothing. There's nothing from Travis. And so while this is all going on, Sheriff Copeland and Sheriff Gillespie have started coming over to Mike Rogers and the rest of the crew and being like, hey, if you just tell us where Travis Walton's body is, like, we'll go easy on you guys. Like, we know you did it. And they can feel that the pressure is really mounting, that if they don't find Travis, even though they didn't do anything, according to their story, they're going to face serious repercussions because that's the way the world works. You don't get to say aliens did this and not have any blame placed on you because there's no proof. They just have their own eyewitness testimony. That's it. And so the crew has started to become very worried about what's going to happen. They're worried about Travis, of course, but they're starting to see that, like, they're going to be prosecuted for this unless they find Travis. And so they're all very stressed out. And they noticed during the search, this first day of searching, that these 3 guys wearing red jackets had these tools that were scanning the ground, almost like a metal detector. And Mike Rogers, he was hoping that during this investigation that they would have people come out that were like paranormal investigators. I guess maybe he was naive to think that the police would actually do that. But he thought, given the fact that we've all said this is a UFO that zapped Travis, who then disappeared, that they would have at least one person representing the kind of paranormal side of the investigation coming out. And so he sees these guys in red with their special tools that seem like a metal detector, and his gut says they're paranormal investigators. And so Mike goes over to them and he's like, hey, what are these tools you guys are doing? Like, what is this?
And they look at him and they're like, oh, well, this tests for radiation. We're scanning for radiation in the area. And he asked them, like, well, what group are you guys with? Are you with the sheriff's department? And they just didn't really answer him. They said, oh, we're just checking for radiation in the area. That's just what we do. And Mike sees an opportunity, because when that ship emitted that ray of light that ultimately blew Travis Walton 20 feet and then, evaporated him or something, they were within range of that big ball of lightning, and they were very much in the kind of cone where, had there been radiation coming off of that ship, he believed that perhaps they would have been hit with it. And so he asked the guys with the red jackets on and their little radiation tools to scan the crew's jackets and bodies to see if they were radioactive. And so the crew comes over and they scan them, and there's nothing. There's no trace elements of radioactivity. They're like, no, there's nothing. And then Mike realizes that from the time they called the sheriff until this search, they had all the crew gone home and changed, then come out to do this search. And so he thought, well, then, any of the radioactive materials would have been on our clothes, which aren't here, but we have our hard hats in the back of the truck that were out here the whole time. They were potentially exposed to whatever was out there from the ship. Can you test those? And so he brought over one of their helmets, and the guy in red scans his helmet, and the ticker goes all the way over, fully radioactive. And the guy in red, looked up at Mike and looked down at the helmet, and he's scanning it, and he's looking at him, kind of trying to size him up. And then he turns and he kind of gestures at the other two in red and tells them to stop doing what they're doing. And they come over and they're scanning the helmets as well. And then, without any indication of what the results were, what this meant, because Mike is kind of waiting for them to tell them what's going to happen, the guys in red just turn around and say, okay. And they just start walking away. And Mike's like, well, wait, what does this mean? And they don't turn around, and they just walk away from the search site. And so the other crew are watching this happen too. And Mike and the crew are trying to get them to come back, but they're not turning around. They're just leaving, and then they're gone. And so Mike goes over to the sheriffs, who they know the sheriffs think they did something to Travis. These are not their friends, but they figured we need to ask them who those guys in red were. So they go over to Sheriff Gillespie and they're like, hey, who are those guys in red jackets with the radiation detectors? And Sheriff Gillespie's like, who? There's no one here looking for radiation. Everyone here is here because I ordered them to be here. Who are they? Where are they? And he's like, well, they just walked over there. They went around the corner there. And Sheriff Gillespie's like, well, I didn't order them there. And it would turn out that they couldn't locate these three people. No one knew who they were. Mike went around and asked anybody who seemed like an authority figure if they knew who these people were. They asked people if they had interacted with them, and no one knew. So after this search that goes on for a couple of days, turns up nothing. There's no sign of Travis. The town of Snowflake, Arizona really turned on the 6 crew members. Everybody believed that they had done something to Travis, that this UFO thing was a hoax and that they harmed Travis and they were using this as a cover-up. And the sheriff department, they really perpetuated that. They were pretty open about, this is not a UFO situation. This is not an alien abduction. This is a missing person case. And frankly, we believe the UFO thing is a hoax. National and international media had picked this story up, and it became this massively viral story all over the world. And, news media outlets are converging on Snowflake, Arizona, and they're inundating the sheriff's department with requests for more information about this alien abduction. And it's really frustrating the 2 sheriffs who were leading this investigation, Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copland. And they were already skeptical and really upset about feeling like they were being taken advantage of by these crew members, this hoax, right? That's what they believed it was. And so Sheriff Gillespie and Copland decide, you know what? We're going to just cut through all the BS here, and we're going to make these boys take a lie detector test. So they go out and get one of the country's best polygraph examiners to come in and administer a lie detector test on each of the 6 crew members. And so one by one over the course of the day, each crew member was tested for 2 hours, same questions, all centering on the criminal side, the kind of foul play angle for Travis Walton. They all go through it. And it turned out that 5 of the 6 had all shown that they were telling the truth. And the 6th person, it was just inconclusive. It didn't mean that he was lying. It just meant that the test wasn't done very well. And this polygraph examiner had anywhere from a 92 to 98% accuracy rate. He was one of the best in the country. And he even would say, it would be so difficult to fake that. To have 5 people, let's say this is all a big hoax and they harmed Travis Walton. it would be almost impossible to have 5 people be able to pass my examination and have nobody slip up. They were telling the truth. And so the examiner tells the sheriff, and Sheriff Gillespie is dumbfounded because he believed that they were going to find out they were all lying and that this could just be a pure criminal investigation and it would be, let's go find Travis Walton's body. But now the examiner is saying they're telling the truth. And so Detective Gillespie and his partner are like, now what do we do? And then 5 days after Travis's disappearance, Travis shows back up. During numerous interviews, Travis would say that he remembers waking up on a road and he didn't recognize where he was, but it was nighttime, it was raining, and he sensed a very bright light above him. And so as he's laying, he kind of turns his head to look up into the sky and he sees what looks like the underside of that ship, because he remembered how struck he was by the beauty of the kind of engineering underneath that disc UFO they saw in the forest. It looked the same. His vision was not great, but he's looking up and he's pretty confident that's what he's looking at. And then it flies into the sky and it's gone. And he's left in total darkness on a road in some place he doesn't know. And he remembers standing up and feeling very weak and depleted and dehydrated. And he just knew that he had to get to civilization. He had to just go in a direction and find someone who could help him because he was so weak and he would die out there if he didn't find someone who could help. And so he musters the strength to stand up and he starts kind of staggering down the road. And eventually, through just adrenaline, he just starts running. And luckily, he sees up ahead there is a rest stop. And at rest stops, there's payphones. And he makes his way down and he goes to the payphone and he has change in his pocket still. He puts it in the payphone and he ends up calling his brother. And his brother he can't believe he's talking to Travis because Travis is probably supposed to be dead at this point. He didn't believe it was Travis, but Travis just said to him over and over again, "It's me. They brought me back." And he tells him where he is because now he recognizes that this rest stop is actually in Snowflake, Arizona. When his brother picks him up, Travis would say that he believed that this was just minutes after, the initial abduction. He didn't even know he had been abducted. This is like he's coming to and he's like, man, what happened? Like I was just over at that clearing where I saw this ship and now I'm over here. Like, what am I doing here? And so Travis's brother is looking at him like, where have you been? We've been so worried about you for the past several days. And Travis, who was kind of almost catatonic, he's in shock. He doesn't know what's going on. He looks at his brother and he's like, what do you mean days? And his brother's like, you've been missing for 5 days. And so Travis would say that when he heard this news, this revelation that he had been missing for 5 days, it absolutely put him into shock. He was in a catatonic state where he couldn't make sense of it. And so he just sat there quietly. And his brother's looking at him, not really sure what to even ask. He asked a couple times what happened and Travis just didn't answer because he didn't know. He couldn't explain it. And so Travis's brother decides, instead of just immediately calling the police, I want to bring you to a hospital because clearly that needs to happen. And frankly, with the media circus, as soon as they find out you're back, it's just going to be mayhem. And I want to make sure you're taken care of first. So he drives to Phoenix, Arizona, and he brings him to a hospital. And he asks the doctors to be discreet, and he has a doctor do an examination. The doctor knew who Travis Walton was because he'd been following the news. And he's doing an examination of Travis, and, he was malnourished, and he was tired and looked very sick. But there was no physical wounds, with the exception of he had one puncture site in his arm, in the crook of his arm. Travis was not a drug user, so it wasn't like that was, a mark from using drugs. It was a puncture site, and they assumed someone had recently put a needle in his arm. And also the doctor drug tested him and tested his blood, and there was no drugs in his system. It wasn't like he'd been using any sort of substance. So he kind of had a clear bill of health, minus the injection site and looking pretty ragged. And so after the examination, Travis's brother brings Travis back to his home in Phoenix, Arizona. As soon as they get back, his home phone is getting constant phone calls. It had made its way to the sheriff's department back in Snowflake, Arizona, and they are nonstop calling Travis's brother. Like, hey, we hear he's back. We have to talk to him. We have to talk to him. Sheriff Gillespie, he drives all the way to Phoenix. He goes in and he sits down to talk to Travis. And Sheriff Gillespie would say that Travis looked like he was in shock. He looked like he had been through something traumatic. It did not seem like he was acting. And he starts asking Travis what happened. And Travis, he does mention the UFO. He mentions seeing this thing in a clearing. He gets struck by some light. He doesn't know what it was.
And then, he's on the road 5 days later and he can't really make sense of what happened. He just didn't really know what happened over the 5 days. And finally, Sheriff Gillespie just kind of doesn't really give up. He's like, well, we have no way to arrest him. We have no proof of anything. And so he just said, we're going to be in touch. And he drives back. And then media starts showing up. Huge news trucks start showing up outside. Everybody found out, because this was a huge story, where he was, and everybody wanted answers. Finally, the National Enquirer, they reached out and they said, hey, if you give us an exclusive story, if Travis speaks to us about what happened to him, we will get you out of here. We'll bring you to a private location, and we'll even pay to have Travis undergo a whole other battery of tests that are not typically done to see if they could figure out what had happened to him. And so they agree to go with the National Enquirer. So by the time he's actually sitting there looking at the National Enquirer, he's had a little bit of time to maybe let his memory kind of kick back in about what had happened. And he's having these flashes of memory of what happened over those 5 days. Because initially all he could remember was seeing the craft and then being on the road 5 days later. And so when he's sitting down with the National Enquirer people, he begins to recall what actually happened over those 5 days. And so this is what he said happened. He said that he remembers getting out of the truck and walking up to this craft. And he remembers his crew members yelling at him to come back. He knew they were yelling at him to come back. He just wanted to look at the craft a little bit longer. And then right as he was about to turn around and head back, the craft started moving. This loud kind of mechanical, eerie sound is being made. And before he had a chance to run back, he gets hit with this lightning bolt of some kind. Then he remembers being in the presence of some doctors. He saw white lab coats, masks, and facial coverings, and he's kind of in and out of consciousness, and he's this orange light around him, but he definitely sees what looks like medical professionals, and he's thinking to himself, whatever happened with that ship, it must have hurt me, and my crew must have scooped me up and brought me to the hospital. And so in his kind of in and out state, he's aware that he's around medical professionals, at least what he believes are medical professionals. And at some point, his vision clears. It goes from foggy and he's in and out to being pretty much lucid. And he looks down at his chest, and there's a rectangular box sitting on his chest that he didn't recognize. It didn't really look like modern medical equipment. It just looked like this almost like rock sitting on his chest. And he looks at that, and then he looks up at one of the people who's wearing a mask, who's working on him, one of the medical professionals. And this person is working on this box. And then the person looks at Travis Walton and then leans in to look even closer at Travis Walton. And Travis is horrified. It was this grayish, thin, narrow-headed figure that was very short, maybe like 4 feet high, who was looking in at him, and its eyes were like slits. And it's looking at Travis. And Travis, who's unbelievably scared at this point, pushes everything off of him and rips out all the cords that are attached to him. He kind of topples off of this table that he was on. And he realizes he's in a fairly small room. And there's 3 of these humanoid creatures in the room with him. And he picks up the biggest instrument he can see next to the table that he was just laying on. He didn't know what it was. And he starts kind of wildly waving it at them and screaming to leave him alone, like, get away from me. And he's trying to make sense of what he's looking at, and the 3 figures in lab coats start walking closer and closer to him. And they're just kind of looking up at him, trying to study him a little bit. They get all the way up to him, and he's waving, and he's almost about to hit one of them when they just kind of abruptly turn around and leave the room, leaving him alone in this kind of examination room. And as soon as they leave, he watches them go down the little, outside the door, down the little hallway, and they turn left. And so he's practically paralyzed with fear, but he knows if he can't get out of this room, he's done for. And so finally, he kind of gets himself together and he walks past the examination table. He goes down the hallway outside of the door, and instead of going left where they went, he kind of sneaks off to the right and starts walking. And he comes to another room, and it's a room that has a single chair in it. It's this tiny little room with a chair, and the chair is turned away from him. He begins to peer around the chair, and he sees that no one is sitting there. So he goes in front of the chair, and he's like touching the wall, looking for a doorknob or any sort of mechanism that can get him out of this room. And he said, like, the room, it was like this perfectly flat. Everything was flat and smooth. There was no door handles. He couldn't find a way out. And he ultimately sees on the chair that it looks like there's some buttons on the chair itself. And he pushes all these buttons on the chair and nothing happens. And then in the doorway where he came in, suddenly a person, a man, appears in the doorway who's wearing what looks like a spacesuit, like an astronaut suit. And Travis is so immediately relieved, even though the weirdness of him being in an astronaut suit is pretty high. But he's like, it's a human. And he doesn't know what to think about the fact that he's now excited to see a human, right? Like, it's terrifying that you were just around these non-humans, but he's like in panic mode now. He sees another human being and he runs over to him and he says, please, you got to help me. I don't know where I am. You know, where are we? What is this? What's going on? And he notices that the eyes of this person inside of the spacesuit, it's a man who at least looks like a man, but his eyes are distant. He's not making eye contact with Travis. It's like he's in a trance. And he said his eyes just seemed off. Like they weren't focused on him. It would be like if you're talking to someone, but they were like permanently looking away from you. There was just something off about him and he never spoke. And so he's trying to ask this guy, like, where are we? And the guy takes him by the arm and he just starts leading him back into the hall where he came from and continued down the hall, not back towards the room where he was originally, but down the hall in the other direction. And they get to another door and he opens it up and Travis the whole time is like pleading with this guy to help him. And he thinks that this guy is helping him. He thinks that this is his savior. And he feels relieved that a human being, albeit a strange human being, is helping him. And eventually he stops asking him any questions because the guy in the spacesuit's just not reacting to him. They open this door and they go down into this huge hangar where there's all these spacecraft that look just like the one that he saw in the clearing, that Travis saw in the clearing. And they start walking down between all these spacecraft that are just hovering, much like they were hovering in the forest, seemingly able to just defy gravity. And the whole time, this guy in the spacesuit's saying nothing. And Travis is like, what is this? What are these craft? Is this military? Saying nothing. They walk to the far side of the hangar and they open up another door and they go into this bright white room. And there's 3 more human-like people with the strange eye thing going on in spacesuits that are standing there next to another medical table. And they're looking not at Travis, but their bodies are aimed in the direction of the door they came in through. Travis goes in and he sees these 3 and he thinks, these people are here to save me. Like, again, I feel relieved to see humans, albeit strange humans, but nonetheless humans. And the guy who had brought him in there continues to lead him over to the 3 other people. And they pick him up and they put him on the table. And he starts kind of resisting because he doesn't know what they're doing. They're not speaking. He's like, what are you doing? And they force him onto this table. And he's feeling pretty weak at this point. And they take a gas mask and they put it over his face. And then he blacks out. And his next memory after that is when he woke up on the road and had the light above him that flew away and he had to run down to the payphone to call his brother. Travis did not immediately go and speak to the crew members that were there that night. It took quite a bit of time. You know, he was talking to press. He was, doing interviews. The police wanted to talk to him. There's a lot going on. But he eventually got together with the other 6 crew members and they all met up at Mike Rogers, the crew boss's house. And they just said, you got to tell us what happened. And so he sits down and he tells the story. All of them believed him. They didn't want to believe him, but they believed him because they saw the first half of this story. They saw it for themselves. And once he was done telling it, they didn't really have that many questions. They just felt bad. They felt like if they had just stayed there and taken Travis, he wouldn't have been taken, but they didn't know that. And so all of them would leave Mike's house that day and they would all go their separate ways. They did not stay in touch. They went their separate ways. It was like this hugely traumatic event that even to this day, 40 plus years later, when they talk about it, they're often brought to tears. Ken Peterson, his interviews are particularly striking because when he talks about it, he's an older man now. And he says, to this day, I'm scared to look out my window because I'm afraid I'm going to see a spaceship. And he starts crying when he talks about it. I mean, this had a profound impact on these 7 men. And some of them didn't do so well. This whole story, it ruined their credibility. Even though this is, the most believable alien abduction story, the truth is most people think it's a hoax. One of them, like his own family, basically disowned him because they felt so embarrassed about this whole story. They don't believe him. So if this was a hoax, like to what end? What did they get out of it? Nothing. It damaged their lives. Following this case over the span of 40 years, there would be 16 lie detector tests taken, 5 by Travis Walton and 11 by the remaining crew, and they would all pass. The one member of that initial polygraph set, when 5 had passed and 1 was inconclusive, he was retested, the same exact test, and he did pass. It's just one of those things where we're left with this incredible story where modern technology says they're telling the truth, but we can't fit that truth into what we think of as normal life. And so we've just decided that there's going to be a group of people that believe and there's going to be a group of people that don't. And you're left to pick which side you're on. Just 30 years ago, we had not discovered a single planet outside of our solar system. Today, we've discovered over 4,500 of them, and of all those planets we're discovering, 1 in 5 of them, scientists now say, are most likely habitable. There's really 2 criteria for a planet to be considered habitable. 1, it needs to be rocky, and 2, it needs to fall into the Goldilocks zone, where it's in its star's orbit in a place where it's neither too hot or too cold, allowing water to be in liquid form. One of the best chances we have so far at finding life on another one of these habitable planets is a planet called Ross 128b. It orbits an inactive red dwarf star, meaning it's likely not being bludgeoned by solar radiation, and we've detected strange signals emanating from the nearby host star, signals that perhaps have intelligent origins. Another habitable planet is Proxima b. It also happens to be the closest habitable planet to Earth and is a lot like Ross 128b. However, the red dwarf it revolves around is much more temperamental and periodically casts out massive amounts of radiation that does make life quite difficult. It's also tidally locked and in synchronous rotation with its star, meaning one side of the planet is always facing the star and getting completely torched all the time. The other side, the dark side of the planet, never faces the star, and so everything is frozen. And so the only place liquid water could exist on Proxima b would be at the equator. Another area of the universe that scientists are focused on to try to see if there's life there right now, or could be life, is an area called the TRAPPIST-1 system. It's actually 7 different planets, all of which are considered habitable, that are orbiting around this one particular red dwarf. The really cool thing about this particular system is that the 7 planets are super close together. So close that if you were standing on one, you could look up and see all of the others, and you're so close, you could actually make out geologic formations like mountains, and you could see clouds, and in theory, you could actually travel between the different planets. So imagine going on vacation to another planet. But to really get you thinking, a new study just released its results this month in October 2020. They looked at all 4,500 plus planets that are outside the solar system, and they ranked them according to how likely they are to sustain life. Not whether they're currently sustaining life, but looking at their conditions of how good of a planet are they to sustain life. And out of the 4,500, there were 24 at the top of the list that not only can sustain life, but actually can sustain life better than Earth can. They are considered super habitable, and they are literally better places to live than Earth is, which is definitely a foreign concept for most people because they think of Earth as like this oasis in this vast universe where everything lined up perfectly to sustain human life. And already, just out of the 4,500 planets that were reviewed, that have only been discovered in the past 30 years, right? There's lots more planets out there. We've already found 24 that are better than Earth at sustaining life. So what happens when we discover there are millions, if not billions of planets out there? Just probability alone says there's going to be a heck of a lot more planets out there that are better at sustaining life than Earth, which really forces you to come to terms with the reality that almost certainly we are not alone. Some call this location the most paranormal location on the planet. Others call this whole thing just a big hoax. But what is undeniably true, and frankly what makes this case so much more interesting, is that unlike the vast majority of paranormal stories and claims, this case was put to an enormous amount of scientific scrutiny. In fact, there was a decade-long study done on this case, where PhDs and scientists converged on this one location and basically around the clock studied, all these claims of the paranormal that was happening in the area. And after a decade of research, the findings are pretty mind-blowing. And the case that I'm referring to is none other than the very famous
Skinwalker Ranch. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have a family that purchases a ranch out in Utah, and as soon as they move in, they start noticing some pretty bizarre things around their property. Everything from, some of their livestock going missing or being harmed. They have strange sightings in the woods of creatures and lights in the sky. They eventually report it to the news, and that news story gets picked up by a couple of other outlets, and a billionaire who is obsessed with researching the paranormal sees this story. He buys the property and installs an entire team of scientists and researchers to basically try to figure out what was happening at this ranch. And they spend 10 years studying this ranch. The outcome is, turns out some strange things really were happening there. Before we get started, if this type of content appeals to you, the kind of strange, dark, mysterious content delivered in a story format, well, if that appeals to you, that's what my channel's all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, please gently ransack the like button and then turn on all notifications so you can get all of my content every time I upload every week. All right, on with the story. In the northeastern corner of Utah lies a 500-acre plot of land. It's all desert where a ranch sits, and that is Skinwalker Ranch. It was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was actually built on a piece of land that had apparently been cursed. Prior to its construction, the Navajo tribe had a feud with the Utes Native American tribe. The Utes were selling off other Native Americans that they would capture. They would sell them into slavery to the United States. And so the Navajo, who had previously lived in the area where this ranch actually was built, they were forced off their land as the Utes came in and were rounding them up and selling them into slavery. And before the Navajo left that area, they cursed the land with what's called the Skinwalker curse. The idea was they were going to torment the Utes tribe for the hardships they had inflicted on the Navajo. The Skinwalker curse, legend has it, is this curse where these witches descend on the area and take the form or wear the skin of various predatory animals in the area, namely large wolves and foxes. They inhabit those bodies and terrorize anybody in the cursed land. At some point, this ranch is actually built on the land that had apparently been cursed. It wasn't until many years later when owners of that ranch started seeing predatory animals doing some very strange things in and around their property that they did some research on the area, learned about this curse, and then before long, the nickname had stuck. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased Skinwalker Ranch. It had actually been abandoned by the previous owners for the last few years, so when they purchased it, they got it for way below market price. So they are just so excited to be moving in. They breed cattle, and so they had 500 acres to let their cattle free roam. It was like the dream purchase for this family. And so when they finally do move in, like the day they move in, they don't really care that, the grass is overgrown. It looks like things are kind of in disrepair. And in fact, when they go into the homestead, like the actual house on the property, they were so excited about everything that they kind of overlooked some of the strange things that they immediately noticed about the property. They go inside and every window has a deadbolt on it. The inside and outside of every door in the house, not just the doors leading outside, doors leading between rooms had locks, the front and back side. They noticed these big pikes that were driven into the ground at the front door and back door of the property with massive chains stringing off of them, which looked like, pretty powerful guard dogs had been there. They're thinking to themselves, well, this is a huge piece of property. Perhaps the previous owners are a little bit paranoid because they're kind of isolated. And so they didn't really raise a red flag when, to be honest, had I moved into a property where every single door and window had multiple locks on it, they had these big guard dogs, I'd probably ask a couple questions. But you know what? Terry and Gwen, they're just so excited about this purchase that, again, they kind of just overlook it. So on the day that they are moving in, Terry and Gwen have some family members over to help them offload trucks and move stuff into the homestead. And it's during this process, as they're moving things out of the truck into the house, And again, you got to remember that the house is situated like right in the middle of the property, and you can see in like every direction basically unobstructed because it's basically open desert, with the exception of a couple areas that are, basically forests. And as they're offloading some of the stuff into the house, Terry looks out at one of these tree lines and he notices this huge wolf, or what looks like a wolf, pretty well off in the distance, kind of meandering its way over towards them. But it's far enough off that this is not enough to be totally worried about it. After all, Terry was a rancher and his family were fairly rugged. They carried weapons and they were used to, protecting their livestock from predators. So this was not a, oh my goodness, I can't believe a wolf is near us. It was more like, okay, let's make a note that there's a wolf walking towards us. And so Terry he tells his family, hey guys, just so you know, there's a wolf coming towards us right now. And the whole family is now standing near the truck and they're watching this wolf. And Terry recalled as he's staring out watching this wolf, it's kind of almost walking in like a snake, like a serpentine path towards them from hundreds of yards out. It's still quite a ways out. Terry notices that there was a fence that was out where this wolf is. And the fence was pretty big, and the spaces between posts were about 6 feet. When he had a good look at the wolf next to the fence, he could tell that the wolf was at least 6 feet long. And he was thinking, are my eyes playing a trick on me? That's an enormous wolf. That's the biggest wolf I've ever seen. But the wolf wasn't acting angry or aggressive. It was just kind of skulking its way towards him, very nonchalant, broad daylight. And at some point, Terry and the family, they're standing behind the truck, and Terry said that they all had this feeling that the wolf was not going to harm them. And the wolf got about 100 yards away, and Terry and his family are transfixed. And he even said he didn't understand why they weren't scared or why they weren't, running away or shooting at it or something, but they didn't. All of them are just standing there watching this wolf that's massive. And the wolf is wagging its tail and acting like a domesticated dog. The wolf comes over and goes up near Terry's father, who was there helping unload some of the gear they had. And Terry's father just kind of reflexively reaches out to start petting this. He's petting up at his head level, this massive wolf. And the wolf just acts like a domesticated dog and kind of rubs against his hand and then starts walking away from them, just wagging its tail and not doing anything, not causing them any harm, not snarling, not growling, nothing. But just as nonchalantly as it walked over to them, it walks over to where they had a pen with a couple of cows and calves inside of this pen. And one of the calves had its head through the post that was keeping them in this cage, just kind of watching this wolf. And the wolf notices it and in an instant jumps over to this calf and immediately has the whole head of the calf in its jaws, just trying to rip it out of the cage. But it can't get it to squeeze through the cage. And so all of a sudden, Terry and his family are broken out of this weird trance. And Terry starts firing shots at the wolf. It strikes the wolf and has no impact. They run over, they start hitting it with the back end of an axe. They're trying to get this thing off of the calf because their livestock, that was their livelihood. And, these are rugged people. And so they're trying to fight to save their property, to save their cows. And the wolf is just totally unaffected. It's not trying to attack Terry or his son that are trying to get rid of it. The wolf is just trying to attack the cow, but it won't let go. And finally, it just kind of gives up on the calf, starts kind of retreating. Terry ends up getting his rifle, a high-powered rifle, and takes a shot at the wolf one more time. But again, it just has no impact on the wolf. And the wolf just, at some point, just as, bored, turns around and kind of trots off into the woods. After they kind of were brought out of that initial trance, that they remembered this horrible smell that's foul, almost chemical smell that just permeated the whole area after the wolf was there. Terry and his son, they decided to go track this wolf because now there's this massive predator that's going to make owning cattle extremely difficult. And so they would have to go deal with this predator. And so instead of retreating into the house, they grab their weapons and they track the wolf that's now jogged off into the forest. And they make it to an area in the forest where the ground is very muddy and sodden. And Terry could easily make out these footprints that just suddenly stop. And they just couldn't make sense of it. And so they went back to the house and they told their family, we tracked it into the woods. There's no blood trail. There's nothing. It just walked in and vanished. So this is day one of being at this ranch. And they're all on edge now. The whole family is on edge. They really don't know what to make of that wolf. The sheer size of it, the fact that it was totally unaffected by being shot multiple times. There's real concern over their own livelihood because they keep cattle and they're only going to have more that are going to be out in these pens. And if there are wolves that are 3 times the size of a normal wolf that are walking around killing cattle, that's a big problem if you own cattle. And so they're on edge, and they're all in a way trying almost not to talk about how crazy and how bizarre that encounter with the wolf was. They're just like, they're treating it like it's just a normal predator problem. Like, man, we gotta get those wolves. We gotta protect our cattle. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're like, something very strange is happening here. Gwen, she was having some other very strange things that were happening to her that she was not tying to the wolf thing. She was just noticing a couple of distinct things that were happening to her that made her think that she actually had a very real, medical problem, that she had true memory issues. Because 2 things happened. One, in that first week, she had gone to the grocery store, and when she came back, she put the groceries away, and then she left to go to the other room. And when she came back, all the groceries were now back in the bags. And so for 20 minutes, she's just sitting there dumbfounded with, did I put the groceries away? Same day, she goes to take a shower, and she hangs her towel in the bathroom like anyone would, and she takes a shower, and then when she gets out, the towel's missing. And she's like, she gets another towel and she towels off, and then she finds the towel hanging up in a closet on the other side of the house. And so between the groceries and the towel, she's like, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Am I having a medical issue here that I'm literally losing my mind? And it wasn't until Terry actually had a similar experience that she started to wonder if this had to do with maybe the strangeness with the wolf, that maybe there's just something odd happening about this property. And it was Terry, in that first week, he had been digging holes for a new fence. And he had this big fence digging tool. It was about 70 pounds that he was using to dig the holes for the fence. And so he had taken a break after making a bunch of posts for this fence. He took a break, left his fence digging tool, at the last place he had dug a post, and he went in to grab a bite to eat, came back out, and his fence digger is missing. And initially he just goes into the house and he's like, hey, to his wife, to his kids, did you guys move my fence digger? Do you know what happened to it? Where is it? It's not out there. And they're like, no, we've been in the house the whole time. I have no idea. And so they couldn't find it. And a week goes by, and he's out patrolling his property looking for wolves. And in the tree, well away from where he had been digging the post before, in the tree, his fence digging tool that's 70 pounds is 70 feet in the air, strung up in this tree. So Terry comes back to the house and he tells his family about the fence digging tool being in the tree. And that's when Gwen tells Terry about her experiences with the groceries going back in the bag and a towel being moved around the house. And everybody in the family starts to really start being scared. We can't explain what's happening on this property, and we're very isolated. And what's the deal with all these locks on all the doors? They're starting to feel really concerned. Following the fence digging tool being found, Terry started to notice lights on his property. Initially, because this was the first couple of weeks they're there, he would see lights way at the far end of his property that looked like headlights. And he would think someone must have made a wrong turn that wound up on my property. We're kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and they'll just leave. And so when he first started seeing these lights, that's what he assumed it was, just people making a wrong turn. But he started to see it so often that he wondered if people were illegally hunting on his property. And so one night he sees these lights on his property and he goes out to investigate. In fact, he's angry. He's had all these strange things happen. His family's on edge, and now he's mad and he's going to take it out on this person who's illegally hunting on his property. And he starts charging out to these lights, and he starts getting closer and closer, and he starts to realize it's not making any sound. If this was a truck, it's not making any sound. And we're in an area where I could totally hear that if it was a vehicle, and he can't hear anything. And as he gets closer and closer, the lights start retreating from him without making a sound, and then float up into the sky and disappear. And Terry's like, what is going on here? The winter rolls around, and it's a particularly brutal winter. And one night, he couldn't account for one of his cows. And so he's out looking for this one stray cow, and he searches his whole property, and there's only one area that he hasn't searched, and it's that forest where that giant wolf had disappeared after marching in there, and they tracked it in there. And so he goes in there, and as soon as he gets to the tree line, he notices there's a bunch of footprints from what looks like a cow. And he's relieved because it's probably his. He follows it into the woods, and much like the wolf that had just disappeared in that muddy, sodden area in the forest, in the same spot, the footprints that appeared to be this cow had also just, disappeared. And then over the course of the remainder of the winter, that would happen 4 more times. The animals would run away and just disappear without a trace. By the end of the winter, after all these animals have just mysteriously disappeared, Terry and his family, but Terry in particular, has really gone into full paranoia mode. He, at night, would just stalk his own property, hiding behind bushes with his weapon, and hope to see what was taking his cattle. And so one night, as he's, doing another fruitless search around his property, he catches out of his periphery what looks like a kind of mass of something moving around in the trees near his property. And at this point, he was kind of obscured by some shrubs and some plants. And so he kind of crouched down and looked out at the tree line. And he sees in the tree line this strange shape kind of moving about inside of the trees. And he would describe the mass as looking almost like a stealth fighter jet, but really small. And it was making no sound, and it was hovering about 20 feet off the ground. And he's crouched down, not making a sound, watching it. And it's just kind of moving around the tree line. And it has these lights it looks to be kind of scanning the ground. And it's just kind of moving around. It's shining these lights, these multicolored lights in the ground. And Terry moves a tiny bit to get a better angle on this thing. And he makes the tiniest of noises against the brush, just like a tiny little, barely audible sound. And this mass that's pretty far away, the lights immediately turn off, and it angles itself so it's facing directly at Terry. And Terry can feel it right away that it's heard this tiny little sound he's made, and now it's staring directly at Terry. And Terry's terrified, and he's looking at this thing, wondering oh my God, is it gonna come take me? What is this? Is this the thing that's been taking my livestock? And he's terrified, and he's staring at it, and it just flies away. By the spring of 1995, things have gotten really, really bad for Terry and his family. Now, not only are they losing livestock inexplicably, but they're showing up. The actual cows themselves are showing up back on their property, hours or days later, just kind of in random locations on the property. And they look like they've had surgery done, precision cuts, and pieces of them are missing. And in addition, some very strange things are happening at the house. At night, they would see these entities walking around their property, these humanoid, they described them as having no expression, just walking around their property. And sometimes they would walk right up to the glass, put their hands on the glass and look in, but there was no face. And Terry and his family, they had blinds down, and they would use the deadbolts on every single door and window, but they could hear them rapping at the glass, and they could hear them communicating in a language they didn't understand right outside of their house. And this became so regular that it was almost impossible to sleep. Terry's kids started performing very poorly in school because they weren't sleeping. Terry's wife, Gwen, she lost her job at the bank because she wasn't sleeping, and she was delusional. They were all just at an absolute breaking point. Terry is now feeling totally disheartened. One night he's sitting on his porch with his rifle, and he notices out on the horizon a new phenomenon. He was used to seeing the lights on his property that would be off in the distance that would disappear, and he had previously seen that kind of fighter jet thing that was scanning the area. Those were 2 types of lights he would see, but there was a new light he saw as he's sitting on his porch. It was almost like this orangey orb that appeared off in the distance. Since he had his rifle with a high-powered scope on it, he just lifts up his rifle and he looks through his high-powered scope, and he zooms in all the way, and he can see that this orb, he describes it as a portal. That as he's looking at it, it has almost like an oval shape to it, and even though it was nighttime, In the middle of the orange orb is this blue sky. It's as if he's looking through a portal into another world where it's broad daylight and there's a sky. And he doesn't know what to make of it, but he can see that a black figure is crawling out of this portal into his property. And it looks just like the black entities that were basically walking around his property at night. In addition to these figures that are crawling, like imagine that scene from The Ring where the girl crawls out of the well. They're crawling out of this portal into his property and then scurrying away into the tree line. And he sees weird craft as well coming into his property through this portal, and then the portal shuts and disappears. Following this night with the orange portal, Terry started to notice blue orbs that he and his family would say were the worst and most terrifying thing of all of the things they experienced. And considering they had tall, featureless black humanoids peering in their windows and rapping on their windows, that's saying something, okay? So a blue orb started showing up on their property. And the way they described it, Terry and his family, was whenever the orb came near you, it gave you this extreme sense of anxiety. It was almost like it was emitting this feeling that you automatically got where suddenly you were unbelievably anxious and terrified of the blue orb. And then as soon as it left, you would, not be anxious anymore. And so one night he's sitting on his porch like he had begun doing, and he sees this orb show up on his property. And his 3 dogs are sitting with him that see the orb, and they start growling and barking. And so he lets his dogs go, thinking that maybe they can scare this thing off. And the dogs take off running towards this blue orb. And they chase it, and you can see the orb, Terry can see the orb that starts to kind of retreat. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, I finally won something. My attack dogs are going to scare this orb away. And they chase off into the woods, and he sees this thing, the blue orb, retreat into the woods. And then when he's thinking again that finally a little victory for us, he hears his dogs yelping. And he's too terrified to go check it out. And so he ends up going inside and locking the doors, locking the windows like they had been, and just kind of retreating. So the next day, when the dogs haven't returned, Terry and his son, they go out looking for the dogs in the forest. And when they get out there, they get to a clearing and they find 3 stacks of ashes in like little burned out circles, as if there had been a fire previously in these 3 little spots. And it turned out it was the ashes of his 3 dogs that had gone into the woods. They had just been vaporized. Terry decides that it's time to leave, and he wants to sell the ranch. And so he puts the property up for sale and goes to a local news outlet, and he tells them about what's happening on his property. And as fate would have it, a billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in standing up this scientific research team, this all-star team of PhDs, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. Basically, he was obsessed with the paranormal and wanted to investigate the paranormal. And he had actually seen that fairly obscure story when he saw that it was up for sale. Robert Bigelow, the billionaire, saw this great opportunity to buy the piece of property and actually make it the headquarters of his own scientific research team, not only to investigate what was happening on Skinwalker Ranch, but use it as kind of a hub to do other scientific research. So he purchases the ranch, and Terry actually, even though he did not want to spend any time at the ranch, on some level wanted to know what the research was going to show, because he was very curious, like, what is going on at this ranch that's been plaguing my family. So he offers to stay on as kind of like the ranch manager, because, Robert Bigelow and his team are a bunch of scientists and business people. They don't have any experience on the ranch, and so they're happy to keep him. So Terry is still connected to the ranch, but at this point he's sold it to Robert Bigelow. So Robert Bigelow's scientific team was called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, N-I-D-S, NIDS for short. And Bigelow had actually built the team before purchasing Skinwalker Ranch. And what he went out and did is he recruited some of the most incredible scientists and PhDs he could possibly recruit, but he didn't want people that were interested in the paranormal. He wanted people that were inherently skeptical, so that if he was ever able to kind of prove the existence of high strangeness, that he would have credibility in doing that. And so he went out and found these incredibly skeptical, incredibly smart scientists and PhDs. And so they move into Skinwalker Ranch. And the first thing they do is they need to start doing testing to make sure that this whole, all the stories about Skinwalker Ranch coming from Terry and his family were not just some grand illusion by the family that, they could have just made it up. And so they get in there and they start running these tests. So that first year, as they're running these tests, which are largely things like, okay, let's check the environment and see if there aren't any, plants that are giving off spores that could be hallucinogenic that they're breathing in. Let's check their water supply and make sure there wasn't something happening in their water supply. Let's do psychological assessments of the family. Let's ask neighbors. Let's do all of our diligence to make sure it's not something environmental or psychological. And over that first year, while they're doing this research, there isn't much activity at the ranch, save a couple of instances where there were some strange lights. So that first year is fairly uneventful, but what's important is that the NIDS researchers come to a conclusion that this did not seem like a hallucination. This did not seem like a something coming from, a plant or water supply. This seemed like the Terry and his family were really experiencing something odd. They just didn't know what it was. One day, Terry and actually Gwen, who was helping him, were tagging some of the new calves, the new cows that had been born, putting these little tags in their ears. And so Gwen was there helping. And so Terry and Gwen, they tagged this new calf, put a yellow tag in its ear, and they move on and they're tagging other animals. And so for about 40 minutes, their eyes and their attention are not focused on this one calf or that one area of the ranch. They're tagging other animals. And then their dog that was with them starts growling and reacting in the direction of where this calf had been. And so Terry and Gwen turn around and they look and they don't see anything. And they start walking over. They find the calf that they had tagged about 40 minutes ago has been basically surgically dissected. And all that's left are its legs and its head. And in addition, the ear where that tag was had been removed. And so they immediately call over the NIDS researchers. So the NIDS veterinarian comes over and looks at the scene and just can't make sense of it because the incisions on the calf were so well done that it looked like someone with real surgical expertise had done this on an operating table. There was no sign that this was done by a predator, and there was no blood anywhere. So this prompts a massive search of the property, because in many ways, this is what the NIDS researchers are looking for, are real occurrences of something that is highly strange that they can go investigate. And so all of the researchers and everybody there begins searching the property for whoever was responsible for this dissection of the cow. And they start searching the property, and the dogs, they had all these guard dogs that were kept at each of these observation posts that they had set up around the ranch as soon as the NIDS team had moved in. They were all looking in the same direction, all four of these four observation posts, and they're all cowering in the back of their cages, all looking in the same direction. And so they start making their way towards the tree line where all these dogs are looking, and they stop short when Terry says, "I see something in the tree." So they stop their car and they're looking, and in the tree is this massive wolf, this like wolf-like humanoid that's basically perched on a tree limb. And Terry takes out his rifle and he aims at the creature up in the tree, this huge creature, and everybody sees it. All the NIDS researchers are looking at this creature and they're like, "Oh my God, what is that?" Terry starts firing at this thing, and it just disappears into the woods. And so the team charges into the woods, they fan out, and they pick up a couple of tracks of this huge thing that has like this massive footprint with these huge claws. But much like the wolf that had disappeared and the cattle that had suddenly disappeared when they went into the woods, they couldn't find any traces of this thing. But they did smell this horrible stench that Terry remembered smelling. It stuck with him that first day when that large wolf had come over on the very first day they were moving in. It was that same smell, but they couldn't find this huge animal. So dumbfounded, the NIDS researchers just go back to the property and no one can make sense of it. And they have the footprint and they have their own eyewitness testimony, but like they couldn't make sense of how something that big could just get away. And so over the following month, they're like searching the property and they're looking for any more signs of this huge creature or anything. The only thing they noticed is that the guard dogs consistently stayed in their kennels and did not want to come out. They were acting like they were kind of being hunted, and they were they were cowering quite a bit, and they were scared to go out in the open, but they couldn't find anything. So it was around this time that Terry and Gwen are kind of back to doing work around the ranch, and one day they're driving off to one section of the ranch, and they pass by the corral where 4 of their prized bulls were. These are very expensive animals that are all in this enclosure. And so they drive past and they take a mental note that they're seeing these bulls in this enclosure, and they drive off to the other side of the ranch where they're doing some work, tagging animals and, building fences, whatever it is they were doing. But when they come back and they round a corner where they're first able to see that corral of bulls again, they are like, where are they? Because the bulls were not in their enclosure, and they weren't anywhere. And so they're panicked because these are very expensive animals, and they run over, and Terry sees that the gates to the corral are still locked, but there's no bulls in there. There's no sign of a struggle or anything. And it just so happens that right next to the corral was this fairly small trailer that hadn't been used in years. In fact, it was literally wired shut. It was just sitting there. And Terry, just for whatever reason, runs over and looks in one of the windows. And inside of this tiny enclosure are these 4 bulls, completely calm, all crammed into this tiny trailer. They could barely fit. They're not fighting with each other or anything. They're just calmly sitting there as if they're in some kind of a trance. And Terry yells to Gwen, like, hey, they're over here. They're right here. And it startles the bulls out of their trance. They start panicking and kicking, and they end up getting them out of this enclosure, and it takes them hours to finally round them up and get them back in the corral. But they're unharmed. But it is almost impossible to get even one bull into that small of an enclosure. It would take hours to maybe be successful at doing that. To get 4 bulls into that enclosure was pretty much impossible. And to do it when they basically were calm after they were in there is also somewhat impossible. And it was important to note that Terry saw when he looked in the window that the only entrance to that trailer was wired shut still. It had not been undone. In fact, the cobwebs at the corner where the opening basically formed with the sides of the trailer, they were still intact, like it had not opened. And it made no sense how those bulls got in there. And so the NIDS researchers come over, and they can't make sense of it either. Upon further investigation, the NIDS researchers found that the bars of the corral that held the bulls, a section of it had been highly magnetized. And so while they're doing this research, trying to figure out if magnetic fields has anything to do with the strange occurrences at the ranch, 2 of the NIDS researchers were on the outskirts of the property using their compass to look for magnetic fields, and they started smelling. They both reported smelling that horrible metallic, rotting smell that other people had reported smelling anytime they saw that large wolf creature. And when they started smelling it, their compass started to flitter and then pointed away from north towards wherever the smell was. And they remember thinking that they felt like they were being watched. And it went on for a few moments, and their compass didn't waver. It was aimed in the direction of the smell, and they're both on opposite sides, pointing in the same direction. And then at some point, the smell stops, and they stop feeling anxious, and the north arrows go back to the way they should have been. And then one of the most terrifying of all of the paranormal occurrences that happened at Skinwalker Ranch happened at the very end of 1997. 2 NIDS researchers were up on a ridgeline overlooking the homestead. Every night it became commonplace to basically position NIDS researchers all over the property to basically be on the lookout for weird things that are happening. And these 2 researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape right near the homestead. And one of them had infrared goggles, and so he looks down at the orb, and he can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening that sounded an awful lot like what Terry had seen on his porch when he saw that humanoid creature crawling out of the portal into his property. Well, these 2 researchers are looking at this portal, and they see the same thing. They see this black human-like creature crawling out of this orange portal onto the ground, and then it starts running up the hill towards them. and they're like frozen with fear. They start smelling that horrible rotting metallic smell as this big human-like creature bounds up the mountain, and they can hear the shale under its feet as it runs up, and it goes right past them. About 30 feet away from them, they're looking at it, and it just barrels past them at a full sprint up into the mountainside. The following year, in 1998, the activity on the ranch declined significantly. All they had was the occasional strange lights here and there, but for the most part, it was done. And in fact, even though NIDS remained on the property, by 2004, the research just wasn't amounting to anything, so they pulled the plug on the operation. They did have footage of a number of the lights that were seen, but again, no one's going to take a picture of some random lights and say, oh, there you go, proof. You know, they demonstrated that there were, you know, magnetic fields, and they have images of these calves that would reappear after looking like they'd had surgery done to them. They had hundreds of eyewitness reports. You know, they have all this information, but none of it was really definitive proof, which was very frustrating to Robert Bigelow, to Terry and his family. And the way they described it is they felt like they were dealing with an entity or a group of entities that were just consistently one step ahead of them, that they could catch glimpses of what they were doing, but it was never enough to really understand what was happening. They never felt like they were in control. It was always clear that this entity or these entities were in control of the situation, and they never were in a good position to really record hard data or get good footage. Not to mention, this is 1998, this is the late 90s. No one just had like, you know, an iPhone they can pull out and snap pictures. You had like real cameras. And so the best they could do was some pictures of light and some of the animals that had been mutilated. There's been numerous books put together by some of the people that were a part of this NIDS research team, and to this day, they believe that what they saw was a result of some paranormal activity. And to this day, many people believe that this is one of the most credible instances of paranormal activity occurring. There is a taboo that is held in the scientific and academic communities, as well as in government, news media, and all modern institutions. And that taboo is on taking UFOs seriously. As a result of this societal conditioning, many people simply don't believe in UFOs. And those same people will view others that do believe in UFOs or who are open-minded to it as the crazy people, when in reality, UFOs are blatantly real. I mean, blatantly so. And they've been whipping around Earth for some time. But because of that taboo, scientists and politicians, they don't want to do the research to figure out why they're here, because it's career suicide. And what's worse is there's all sorts of programs, like I'm going to tell you about in a minute, that are designed to keep people conditioned to believe that everything is ponies and rainbows, and there's no aliens, there's no UFOs, there's no anything but Earth. In 1952, a CIA group called the Psychological Strategy Board concluded that the people in the United States are prone to mass hysteria when it comes to UFOs, and that we should be actively debunking any organization or person or group that is trying to get to the bottom of UFOs or other unexplained phenomena. It seems like the reasoning behind this was to protect the public from themselves. They did not want the public to discover something as momentous as the discovery of a UFO that is connected to extraterrestrials or some other unexplained phenomenon. They didn't want the public to discover that. They wanted the government to make that discovery so it could be controlled, the narrative could be controlled, and they could protect the public from falling into mass hysteria. Now, while we don't know if the government actually listened to this recommendation and began aggressively censoring any group or organization that was trying to get answers about UFOs, what we do know is that the government at the same time was investing real money to do their own research about UFOs. In December of 2017, the Pentagon had to come out and confirm the existence of a particular program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program after 2 of their videos had been leaked. This highly classified, highly controversial government-funded program investigated UFOs. The 2 leaked videos were filmed by American service members, pilots, when they saw these objects that were flying around Earth that were demonstrating what this program described as advanced physics, which is basically things humans haven't figured out how to do yet. The objects were able to accelerate with g-forces that were too much for the human body to withstand. They could reach hypersonic speeds with no sonic boom and no heat trail. They also seemed to resist Earth's gravitational pull, despite not looking particularly aerodynamic enough to have lift or thrust. Metamaterials that came from these UFOs were made up of materials that you can't find naturally on Earth and would be extremely expensive to replicate. According to a Pentagon briefing this group gave in 2009 about all of their research into UFOs, they concluded that the United States would not be able to protect itself against some of the technology they had discovered. And these two videos that we're seeing are only the ones that were leaked. And in April of 2020, the Pentagon came out and officially confirmed those two leaked videos from 2017 were authentic, and to this day, the crafts or objects that were spotted in those videos are still listed as unidentified. They wouldn't say that unless they made sure it was not just another military craft or some other conventional explanation, meaning, really, we don't know what these things are. Here are the two video clips.
Echo 6-1 Tango Project level.
Oh, got it! Woohoo!
Roger, there's troubleshooting soon as I get.
Did you box moving target?
602.
No, I took an auto charge. Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, dude. Wow, look at it fly! Dude, that's a drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not. That is the LNS, dude. Well, if there's like... Look at that thing!
Late one night in the summer of 1977, a large radio telescope in Ohio intercepted a very unique signal. The telescope was searching the sky on behalf of an organization called SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the signal, although it only lasted 72 seconds, fit the profile of a message beamed to us from another world. Jerry Amon, who was a project scientist for SETI, was flipping through some of the computer printouts generated by the telescope when he noticed a series of letters. Now, the way this particular radio telescope worked is it pretty much constantly picked up a signal, but that signal was a very low background hum of static. And that was represented in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those low numbers are representative of that basic background sound that they just write off. It doesn't matter. Occasionally, the telescope would pick up a higher number on the readout, like a 7, an 8, a 9, and even above that, it transitions to letters to represent louder radio signals. But all of those higher signals had a rational explanation. Either they were anomalous, or they were tied to something very natural and ordinary. But that particular night in 1977, as the telescope swept across the sky, it picked up a signal that was so strong it surged past
0 through 9 and made its way into the letters all the way up to letter U, and it held it for 72 seconds, representing a signal that was 30 times stronger than what this telescope normally picks up as its baseline. And after those 72 seconds, the telescope eventually passed it, and that signal dropped all the way back down. So when Eamon saw this amazing string of letters representing this radio signal, he circled it in red ink and wrote next to it, "Wow!" exclamation point. And from that point forward, this transmission became the wow signal. One of the main reasons the wow signal was not immediately cast out as some anomaly or chalked up to some other natural occurrence is because of what we understand about radio wave transmission. The goal of this radio telescope was to try to pick up radio signals coming in from other worlds. And so the way they did that is they opened up a whole bunch of different channels, receivers, they had 50 of them, and anytime they were aiming their dish in a direction of the sky, if there was any radio waves coming towards them, they tried to capture them on different radio frequencies. If you were aiming your antenna in a direction where natural radio waves were coming towards you, it would hit one channel and then diffuse over adjacent channels because it's not a targeted radio wave. It's natural. It's more like a shotgun blast. Non-natural radio waves, like the ones we're familiar with when we listen to the radio, listen to music, those are targeted radio waves, meaning when they were sent out in a very narrow band. They were sent out on a single frequency. And only people that have turned to that particular frequency or that particular receiver are going to hear your message. That is a non-natural radio wave. The night that the wow signal was picked up, it was only picked up on one channel. It did not diffuse over the others, meaning the wow signal is not natural and was created by someone or something. And for the SETI researchers that are literally combing the sky for signs of extraterrestrial life, this is exactly what they were looking for. It is what an intelligent life form would do to try to communicate. They would use one radio frequency to demonstrate this is intentional. But despite decades of professional and amateur astronomers searching the sky for this wow signal, it's never been found again. While there's many theories about what could have caused the wow signal, obviously ranging from extraterrestrial life to a comet that passed by in 1977 that we only recently knew about, to a secret spy satellite, the bottom line is, to this day, we cannot adequately explain it. It remains the best evidence of alien communication ever obtained.